They say some people get so drunk on power that they stop seeing the difference between right and wrong. And I never imagined I would one day stand in front of my own home watching it burn to the ground because of one woman, one relentless neighbor who believed she owned not just the HOA, but the entire neighborhood. That woman was Karen, and this is the story of how her obsession with control turned my life upside down. It all started when I bought a farm from a friend who was moving overseas. The deal was too good to pass up. Acres of open land, fresh air, peace, and most importantly, freedom. Or at least I thought that's what I was getting. It didn't take long before I noticed something off about the people around here. They weren't just being neighborly. They were watching each other, reporting each other, and handing out warnings like they were soldiers in some dictatorship. That's when I discovered the nightmare hiding in plain sight. My farm fell under the reach of an HOA, and not just any HOA. This one was run by the infamous Karen, the self-proclaimed queen bee who wore her authority like armor and had a personality sharper than barbed wire. The first thing I did, because I value my sanity, was call my lawyer. I told him I wanted out immediately. After weeks of digging, paperwork, and signatures, I was legally free from the HOA. I celebrated that day, believing the nightmare was behind me. No more dues, no more silly regulations, no more having to answer to a woman who thought she was a dictator. But Karen had other plans. Days after I received the letter confirming my release, I found an envelope on my porch. It was a fine from the HOA. At first, I laughed and thought it was an honest mistake. But then another came and another, and each one was more ridiculous than the last. $50 for tractor parking, $100 for fence height, and the most absurd of all, $700 for the so-called crime of attempting to illegally leave the HOA. I tore up the letters, tossed them into my fireplace, and figured eventually she would give up. But deep down I had a bad feeling. Karen wasn't the kind of person to admit defeat. To confirm my suspicions, I went to the HOA office myself. If you could even call it an office, it looked more like a low-budget courthouse with cheap blinds, a flickering light, and a bulletin board plastered with outdated rules. And there she was, sitting behind a cluttered desk like she was presiding over some tribunal. Her hair was sprayed so stiff it could have deflected bullets, and her smirk told me she had been waiting for this confrontation. I put my documents down in front of her and said, "I'm out, here's the proof. Stop sending me bills." She tilted her head, eyes full of condescension, and said, "You're still in my HOA. You don't leave unless I say so." I nearly laughed in her face, but instead I tapped my finger on the lawyer's signature. She didn't even glance at it. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and said, "That piece of paper doesn't mean anything. In fact, I should fine you extra for even trying." My patience broke, and I told her exactly what I thought of her and her so-called authority. That's when her smile faded, her eyes narrowed, and she hissed, "1 week! You and your lawyer better reverse this or you'll regret it." I walked out, leaving her seething behind her desk, certain that her threats were nothing but empty air. But I was wrong. Over the next week, I noticed strange things happening. Cars parked near my property at odd hours. Shadows moving along the fence line at night. The uneasy feeling of being watched whenever I stepped outside. I chalked it up to paranoia, until the letters started arriving every single day, as if she was deliberately trying to break me down. But then came the day that changed everything. I had gone to town to buy supplies. Just an ordinary day, feed for the animals, nails, and a sack of potatoes. But when I returned, my blood froze. Black smoke was rising into the sky from the direction of my farm. My stomach sank as I slammed the gas pedal, tires kicking up dirt. And there it was, my cabin, my home, completely engulfed in flames. I jumped out of my truck, barely registering the searing heat and the roar of wood collapsing into itself. And then I saw her. Across the road, standing with her arms folded like she was watching a performance, stood Karen. She wasn't horrified, she wasn't surprised, she was smiling. Smiling as if this was the victory she had been planning all along. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone and called the fire department, but my eyes never left her. Neighbors started gathering, some panicked, some speechless, but she didn't move. She stood there calmly, like the fire was a show she had bought tickets for. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about fines anymore. Karen had declared war. They say the truth has a way of coming out no matter how carefully someone tries to bury it. And on that day, as the flames devoured my home and neighbors whispered in shock, I knew deep down that Karen's smug little performance wouldn't last forever. The fire trucks arrived, sirens blaring down the dirt road, men leaping out to battle the blaze. But the image of her standing across the street with that crooked grin was burned into my memory. She thought she had finally won, that she had crushed me beneath her fabricated rules and raw intimidation, but what she didn't realize was that I had one ace up my sleeve. Mounted on the corner of my barn, half hidden by vines, was a security camera. It wasn't much, just a cheap model I had installed months earlier, but it had one job: to catch trespassers. And on that day, it had recorded everything. As the firefighters sprayed water and neighbors gathered in tight circles, I pulled out my phone, opened the feed, and there it was. Clear footage of Karen walking around my cabin, a red gas can in her hand, splashing gasoline across the wooden siding like she was painting a mural. The gas can, the lighter, the moment the flames burst to life, it was all there, undeniable. I turned the screen toward the crowd, and suddenly the whispers stopped. The gasps came next, followed by the murmur of phones being pulled out to record. Karen's smile disappeared as fast as the flames had spread. She tried to stammer excuses, but nobody was buying it. My voice was steady when I dialed 911 again, this time not for the fire department, but for the sheriff. Within minutes, deputies rolled up, and Karen, once the queen of the HOA, was pacing back and forth like a cornered animal. I handed the phone to the officers, and when they saw the footage, the decision was immediate. Handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists as neighbors filmed and whispered, their once polite nods turning into sharp stares of betrayal. The woman who had ruled over everyone with fear and fines was suddenly nothing more than a criminal caught in the act. But for me, the battle wasn't over. Losing my home, my belongings, my sense of safety, it wasn't something I could just shrug off. My lawyer and I went into overdrive, filing lawsuits that stacked higher than the rubble of my burned-down cabin. Karen wasn't just guilty of arson. She had trespassed on private property, endangered livestock, destroyed irreplaceable possessions, and shattered the peace I had fought to build. The prosecutors didn't hesitate either. They loaded the charges: arson, reckless endangerment, property damage, trespassing. Each charge hit like a hammer pounding nails into the coffin of her arrogance. Court was brutal. Every time the footage played on the screen, Karen seemed to shrink in her seat. Her attorney tried to spin a story about her conducting a controlled burn to protect the property, but the judge nearly laughed him out of the courtroom. The neighbors who once ignored her antics now testified against her, recounting the harassment, the threats, the endless fines. For once, the weight of her empire was crashing down on her shoulders. When sentencing day came, the gavel fell hard. 5 years behind bars, no parole, plus restitution for the damages she caused. The look on her face was something I'll never forget. The stunned realization that she wasn't untouchable, that her power had limits after all. But the punishment didn't stop there. The lawsuits drained her finances until her home was foreclosed and her car repossessed. She went from HOA queen to bankrupt pariah in record time. The same neighbors who once smiled politely at her now crossed the street to avoid her family. Her name spoken only in whispers as a cautionary tale of what happens when arrogance consumes someone whole. As for me, I began rebuilding. The scars of the fire still mark parts of my farm, a constant reminder of what was lost. But they also stand as proof of what was survived. I learned that freedom is something worth fighting for, even when the enemy is hiding behind fake rules and a false crown of authority. Karen thought she could burn me down to prove a point, but all she really did was light the match that burned her own kingdom to ashes. To this day, whenever I see the charred outline of the cabin's foundation, I don't feel bitterness anymore. I feel relief because justice did come, and Karen, the woman who once believed she ruled an entire community, now has nothing left but the memory of her downfall. So if you've ever wondered whether karma is real, trust me, it is. And sometimes it wears a sheriff's badge, carries a courtroom gavel, and arrives at the exact moment someone thinks they've finally gotten away with everything.